In the summer of 1777, the American Revolution was on the brink of collapse. A massive British army was tearing through New York, and the only thing standing between them and total victory was a single, half-rotten wooden fort in the middle of nowhere. Inside, just 750 American soldiers prepared to face an army nearly 3 times their size, backed by hundreds of native warriors. They had no reinforcements, no escape, no hope. But what these men did in the next 21 days would change the course of the revolution forever. This is the Siege of Fort Stanwix, and the moment a handful of farmers, frontiersmen, and forgotten soldiers saved a nation. August 1777. The British had a master plan to crush the American Revolution in a single stroke. 3 armies would converge on Albany, splitting the colonies in 2 and ending the war. One of those armies, led by British Colonel Barry St. Leger, marched east through the wilderness of New York. His mission was simple: capture Fort Stanwix, sweep down the Mohawk Valley, and link up with General Burgoyne. St. Leger commanded around 2,000 men, British regulars, German Jaegers, Loyalist Rangers, and nearly 800 Iroquois warriors, led by the legendary Mohawk war chief, Joseph Brant. Standing in his way was Fort Stanwix, an old, crumbling fortress that had been abandoned for years. It was rotting, leaking, and barely defensible. But inside that fort was a 28-year-old American colonel named Peter Gainsford, and 750 men from New York and Massachusetts. They had spent months rebuilding the walls with their bare hands, knowing what was coming. When St. Leger demanded their surrender, Gainsford's reply was short and defiant. "It is my determined resolution to defend this fort to the last extremity." The British surrounded the fort. The siege had begun. News of the siege spread through the Mohawk Valley like wildfire. Local militia commander General Nicholas Herkimer, a tough German-American farmer in his 60s, gathered 800 militiamen and marched to break the siege. These weren't trained soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers. Men who had left their fields and families to save their neighbors. But Joseph Brant knew they were coming. On August 6th, in a deep ravine near the village of Oriskany, hundreds of Iroquois warriors and Loyalist Rangers waited in total silence. As Herkimer's column entered the ravine, the trap snapped shut. A storm of musket fire erupted from every direction. The ambush turned into one of the most desperate close-quarters fights of the entire revolution. Herkimer's horse was struck down beneath him. A musket ball shattered his leg, but the old general refused to leave the field. He had his men prop him against a tree, lit his pipe, and continued shouting orders as the battle raged around him. For 6 hours, neighbors fought neighbors in the rain and mud. Loyalists, patriots, men who had grown up together, fought each other at point-blank range in brutal hand-to-hand combat. When it was over, nearly half of Herkimer's men had fallen. The relief column was shattered. Herkimer himself would lose his life from his wounds days later. But the militia had not broken. They held the field. And they had bought the defenders of Fort Stanwix something priceless: time. While the battle raged at Oriskany, something incredible was happening back at the fort. Colonel Gainsford had heard the distant gunfire. He knew Herkimer was fighting for his life, so he ordered a daring counterattack, a sortie straight into the heart of the British camp. Lieutenant Colonel Marinus Willett, a fearless 37-year-old veteran, led 250 men out of the fort's gates while most of the British and Iroquois forces were away at Oriskany. What followed was a disaster for the British. Willett's men stormed the enemy camp, catching the few defenders completely off guard. They overran the tents of Joseph Brant himself. They seized British muskets, gunpowder, blankets, and supplies. But the most devastating loss for the Iroquois wasn't material. Willett's men plundered their camp, taking sacred items, weapons, and personal belongings. For the warriors fighting beside the British, this was a humiliation they would never forget. Willett returned to the fort without losing a single man. He had captured 21 wagon loads of supplies and broken the morale of the British army. Inside Fort Stanwix, the defenders needed something more than just supplies. They needed a symbol. According to legend, it was here, on the walls of this crumbling frontier fort, that one of the first American flags with stars and stripes was raised in battle. The soldiers stitched it together from whatever they could find. Red from an officer's cloak, white from soldier shirts, blue from a captured British coat. When that homemade flag rose above the fort, the message to the British below was clear. We are not your subjects. We are not your colony. We are Americans, and we will not surrender. By mid-August, the situation inside the fort was desperate. Food was running low. The walls were crumbling under constant bombardment. The defenders had been fighting for nearly 3 weeks without rest, but help was finally coming from the most unlikely place. American General Benedict Arnold, yes, that Benedict Arnold before his betrayal, was marching west with a relief force. But his army was too small to defeat St. Leger in open battle, so Arnold turned to a trick. He found a local man named Han Yost Schuyler, a loyalist captured by the Americans, considered touched in the mind by the Iroquois, who believed such people spoke with the spirits. Arnold offered him a deal, spread a false story among the British and their native ally, that Arnold was coming with thousands of soldiers, an unstoppable American army. Han Yost ran into the British camp wild-eyed and terrified. He showed his coat, riddled with bullet holes, claiming he had barely escaped Arnold's massive force. When the Iroquois asked how many men were coming, he pointed at the leaves on the trees. Panic exploded through St. Leger's army. The Iroquois, already demoralized after Oriskany and the looting of their camp, began to desert in droves. Within hours, the British siege collapsed. St. Leger had no choice. He abandoned his cannons, his tents, even his personal papers, and fled north in a panic, chased by the very allies who had once fought beside him. Fort Stanwix had survived. When the smoke cleared, 750 American defenders had held off an army nearly 3 times their size for 21 days. They had endured artillery, starvation, and disease. They had lost friends and brothers in arms, and they had never lowered their flag. But the true impact of Fort Stanwix went far beyond its walls. Because St. Leger's army never reached Albany, General Burgoyne's grand plan fell apart. Weeks later, Burgoyne's isolated army was crushed at the Battle of Saratoga, the turning point of the entire revolution. That victory convinced France to enter the war on the American side. Without French troops, ships, and money, the revolution would have been lost. And none of it would have happened without 750 forgotten men in a rotting wooden fort who simply refused to give up. They weren't generals. They weren't legends. They were farmers, mechanics, and frontiersmen. I'd be grateful if you subscribed. It helps the channel more than you know, and it keeps these stories alive. Thank you.